You are here. The wind hits you before anything else. Not the gentle kind. Not the kind that carries warmth or the smell of something familiar. This wind comes from the south, from a direction that has no name in any language you were raised speaking, and it moves through your clothing as though your clothing does not exist. Your fingers are numb. They have been numb since before dawn, and dawn was 3 hours ago, and you have not stopped walking. The ground beneath you is not soft. It is not forgiving. The steppe of Patagonia in July stretches out in every direction without apology, without color, without the mercy of a single tree tall enough to break the wind. The grass is the color of dried bone. The sky is the color of nothing, not gray, not white, not blue, just a vast indifferent pale that presses down on everything below it. The horizon is so far away that it feels like a punishment. You are small. You have always been small, but here, in this place, smallness becomes something you can feel in your chest. You are cold, not uncomfortable. Cold. The difference is important. Uncomfortable is a feeling you recover from. Cold here, in July of 1892, is a condition that can become permanent. Your boots are not adequate. They were never adequate. They were the boots you could afford, and adequacy was never part of the arrangement. The leather has stiffened overnight into something closer to bark than fabric, and each step requires a moment of negotiation between your will and your body. You smell wood smoke somewhere behind you, the estancia, the place you are required to return to before dark. The place that is not yours, will never be yours, and whose rules govern every hour of your existence. But first, there is work. There is always work. And today, someone found something in the canyon. Something that should not be there. Something that has no explanation that fits the world you were taught to understand. This land does not care if you survive. You are a peon. That is the word they use. It is not a cruel word by the standards of this time and place. It is simply accurate. You occupy the lowest rung of a social ladder that was constructed long before you were born and will remain standing long after you are gone. You did not choose this position. Neither did your father, nor his father before him. The estancia system of Patagonia in the late 19th century is not a system built on opportunity. It is a system built on the assumption that certain men are born to own land and certain men are born to work it. And the distance between those two categories is not bridgeable through labor or intelligence or virtue. It is bridgeable only by birth, and you were born on the wrong side. The estancia you work on is one of dozens that have begun to spread across southern Patagonia, following the Argentine government's so-called conquest of the desert, a military campaign completed just over a decade ago in 1879, which drove the indigenous Tehuelche and Mapuche peoples from these lands through systematic violence and forced displacement. The land was then distributed in enormous tracts to wealthy Argentine and European landowners, men who never set foot in Patagonia, men who received their estancias through political connections and government grants. The man who owns the land you work on has a name you are required to use with a particular tone. Not fear, exactly. Deference. The tone a man uses when he understands that the person he is speaking to holds every relevant form of power over his existence. The estancia employs somewhere between 30 and 60 workers depending on the season. Above you is the capataz, the foreman, a man who earns your obedience through proximity to the patron's authority. Above him is the mayordomo, the estate manager, who communicates directly with the owner and whose word is, for all practical purposes, law. There are no labor protections here. There is no legal recourse for mistreatment. There is no union, no external authority you could appeal to that would arrive in time to matter. If you are dismissed into one of the most hostile environments on earth, in winter, without wages, without a reference, and without transportation to anywhere else. There are also the indigenous workers, the Tehuelche men and women who remained in the region after the conquest, and now work on these same estancias in conditions that are not significantly different from servitude. They are paid less than you, if they are paid at all. They are housed in separate structures, usually at the edge of the property. They know this land with an intimacy that you will never match, its water sources, its animal behaviors, its seasonal patterns. But this knowledge earns them no authority within the estancia hierarchy. It earns them suspicion occasionally. The capataz does not trust what he cannot explain, and much of what the Tehuelche know cannot be explained within the framework he was given. Now that you understand who you are and who you are not, and the precise dimensions of the world you have been assigned to occupy, you can begin to understand what it means to work a day in this place. Your primary task during these winter months is the sheep. Patagonia's economy in 1892 is being rebuilt around wool, and the estancia runs several thousand merino and Corriedale sheep across its hundreds of thousands of hectares. Your job today, as on most days, is to move a section of the flock from one grazing area to another, check the perimeter fencing for breaks caused by the wind or by guanacos, and account for any sheep that have wandered, fallen into a ravine, or died overnight. In Patagonia, sheep die overnight with a regularity that would disturb anyone who had not grown accustomed to it. The cold, the wind, the sudden storms that arrive without warning, a sheep that becomes separated from the flock in July can be dead by morning. You are expected to minimize losses. You are not provided with the tools to minimize losses effectively. This is a contradiction you have learned to live inside of. The work is physical in ways that accumulate. You walk between 20 and 30 kilometers on an active day. You do this in boots that are inadequate, in clothing that is insufficient, carrying equipment that is heavy. Your hands have developed a specific kind of toughness that is not callous exactly. It is closer to a permanent adaptation, a restructuring of the tissue itself. Archaeological studies of laborers from similar periods and regions have found skeletal evidence of this kind of work. Spinal compression inconsistent with age, knee joints showing wear patterns decades ahead of biological expectation, shoulder injuries that healed without treatment and left the bone architecture permanently altered. These are not conditions that are discussed on the estancia. They are simply part of the body you inhabit, the way cold is simply part of the air. The fencing work requires a specific cruelty. Wire fencing, barbed wire, which has only become widely available in the past decade, must be stretched and fixed in temperatures that make the metal brittle and the hands useless. You have seen men lose the feeling in their fingertips permanently after a winter of fencing work. You have, on at least one occasion, seen a man cut himself badly on barbed wire in the cold and not realize it for several minutes, because his hands had no sensation left to report the wound. Infection in this environment, with no medical facility within several days' travel, is a serious event. You know this. You work carefully, but carefully and slowly are the same thing here, and slow work attracts attention from the capataz. There is also the riding. You are not a skilled horseman by the standards of the Patagonian gauchos, the men who grew up on horseback and can read a horse's behavior the way you might read a face. But you can ride well enough to be useful, and being useful is the entirety of your current ambition. The horses on the estancia are not domesticated in any gentle sense. They are managed. There is a difference. A managed horse will carry you. It will not protect you, and it will not forgive you an error of judgment. Today, one of the Tehuelche workers, an older man, perhaps 50, though age here is difficult to read because this climate compresses it, came back from the eastern canyon with a look on his face that you did not know how to interpret. He said something to the capataz in a mix of Spanish and his own language, and the capataz laughed, but it was the laugh of a man who was not entirely comfortable. Later, when you were eating, the older man sat near you and said only, "There are tracks in the canyon. Large ones. Larger than any man. Larger than a horse." He did not elaborate. He finished his food and walked away. Your meal was, as it almost always is, a variation on the same few ingredients. Dried beef. Hard bread. Mate drunk from a shared gourd with the bitter, grassy intensity that by now you no longer taste consciously. It is simply a temperature and a function, something that warms your core for 20 minutes and keeps the worst of the hunger quiet. On days when a sheep has been slaughtered, which happens perhaps twice a week, there is fresh meat, asado prepared over an open fire, and this is the closest thing to abundance that your daily life contains. You eat quickly at these times, not because anyone will take the food from you, but because the habit of eating quickly is the habit of a body that has learned not to trust abundance. The diet is almost entirely protein and fat, with very little vegetable matter. There are no fresh vegetables available in July. The nearest town with a market is Rio Gallegos, which depending on where you are on the estancia might be 2 to 3 days' travel. Provisions arrive periodically on supply wagons, and what arrives is determined by what the mayordomo has ordered, which is determined by what is cheapest, which is determined by a logic that has nothing to do with nutritional completeness. There is hardtack, dried legumes when they are available, occasional tinned goods of uncertain age, mate tea, and salt. Always salt. Salt is the one thing that is never scarce, because salt is how the beef is preserved, and the beef is the economic product that keeps this operation viable. Scurvy is not uncommon on the estancias of southern Patagonia in these years, though no one calls it scurvy. Men develop bleeding in their gums, fatigue that exceeds what the work demands, bruising that arrives without impact. The connection between these symptoms and the absence of vitamin C in the diet is not yet established in the minds of the people living it. Physicians in Buenos Aires have access to European medical literature that is beginning to make this connection, but physicians are not present on the estancia. What is present is the assumption that certain men are constitutionally weak, and that constitutional weakness is a personal failing rather than a systemic one. The food supply is also subject to forces entirely outside your control. A severe winter can prevent supply wagons from reaching the estancia for weeks. A disease moving through the flock can trigger emergency slaughter and alter the food supply in ways that are difficult to predict. A harsh season that reduces the quality of the grazing can affect the weight and health of the sheep, which affects what is available to eat. You are always one severe weather event away from eating significantly less than you already are. Water on the Patagonian steppe is not as scarce as it appears at first, but it is not clean by any standard that would have meaning to you now. The main water sources on and around the estancia are streams fed by snowmelt, shallow wells, and the occasional natural spring. In July, many of the smaller streams are partially frozen or running slow and murky with disturbed sediment. The water you drink is not treated. It is not boiled as a routine practice, though occasionally someone will boil water for cooking purposes. The concept of waterborne illness as a specific, mechanistic process, bacteria entering the body through contaminated water and causing identifiable disease, is present in the scientific literature of 1892, as Pasteur and Koch's work on germ theory has been widely discussed for over a decade. But this knowledge has not translated into behavioral change on an estancia in southern Patagonia. What this means in practice is that intestinal illness is a constant background presence in your life. Not always severe, not always dramatic, but a persistent, grinding disruption to the body's function that compounds every other physical demand you face. Diarrhea in winter, in a place without adequate sanitation infrastructure, is not merely unpleasant, it is dangerous. It accelerates dehydration in a climate that is already drying, it depletes electrolytes that the diet barely replaces, and it weakens a body that cannot afford to be weakened. You have learned to work through it, because working through it is the only available option. There are also the parasites. Internal parasites from undercooked meat or contaminated water are a fact of life here that no one discusses, because no one has a name for the experience beyond feeling poorly, feeling slow, feeling like your body is using its energy for something other than what you need it for. The Tehuelche workers have traditional plant-based treatments for some of these conditions, knowledge developed over generations of living in this specific environment. On the estancia, this knowledge is sometimes used privately, quietly, because offering it openly invites ridicule from the European-descended workers who have been taught to associate indigenous medicine with superstition. The cold itself acts as a kind of preservative in some ways. Bacterial growth is slower at low temperatures, but it creates its own category of invisible threat. Hypothermia in its early stages is indistinguishable from fatigue, and fatigue is your baseline state. A man who begins to lose core temperature in the field may not recognize the danger he is in because its symptoms, slowed thinking, reduced coordination, a peculiar sense of warmth, do not feel like emergency. They feel like tiredness. Men have died this way on the steppe, found later by their colleagues in a position of rest, as though they simply sat down. Among the workers on the estancia, There are 3 children under the age of 5. 2 belong to a married couple who work here together. A woman named Catalina who handles the domestic labor of the main house, and her husband who works with the sheep. 1 belongs to a Tehuelche woman who lives at the edge of the property. These children exist in a statistical context that their parents carry with them constantly, even if the language for that context is never spoken aloud. In Argentina in 1892, infant mortality rates in rural areas are estimated at between 150 and 200 deaths per 1,000 live births, meaning roughly 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 children born in conditions similar to these will not reach their first birthday. The causes are familiar by this point in medical history, even if they are not preventable in this location. Diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections, complications from premature birth, and the simple, unglamorous reality that a malnourished mother produces less nutritious milk, and a child raised in cold and damp and poor sanitation is a child whose immune system is working constantly against the environment it was born into. Catalina's youngest child has been unwell for the past 2 weeks. A cough that began as something ordinary and has deepened into something that wakes the child at night and wakes Catalina with it. You have heard this through the walls of the sleeping quarters. You have not commented on it, because there is nothing to say that would be useful. The nearest physician is in Rio Gallegos. The cost of traveling there is money neither Catalina nor her husband has. The estancia owner's instructions regarding sick workers and their families exist in a gray area of vague paternalism that translates in practice to, "Do not make the problem visible to me." Grief here is not performed publicly. It is a private rearrangement of internal architecture. You have seen it happen to people and watched them return to work the following morning because the work does not pause for loss. The children who survive to adulthood in this environment are not tougher than children elsewhere, though they are often described that way. They are simply the ones who survived, and survival is not the same thing as toughness. It is a different thing entirely. It is luck, intersecting with genetics, intersecting with circumstance, intersecting with the particular virulence of whatever pathogen was circulating that winter. On Sunday, the work is reduced, but not stopped. The Catholicism practiced on the estancia is the Catholicism of a specific social function, not the intimate, questioning faith of the monastery, but the institutional faith of a society in which religious observance is one of the primary mechanisms through which hierarchy is maintained and obedience is framed as virtue. The patron attends Mass when he is present on the estancia, which is not often. In his absence, the mayordomo leads a brief reading from the scripture that lasts approximately 15 minutes and covers, with reliable regularity, passages about the duty of labor, the virtue of humility, and the eternal reward that awaits those who serve faithfully. You do not disbelieve this. That is important to understand. The faith that surrounds you is not something imposed on a population of secret skeptics. It is genuinely held, genuinely felt by most of the people who express it. The question of whether suffering is purposeful, whether cold and hunger and the grinding repetition of days without trajectory are part of a larger design that will eventually resolve into meaning, is not an academic question here. It is a survival question. A man who believes that his suffering is purposeful can continue to work. A man who believes his suffering is random and pointless and will likely end only with death is a man standing at the edge of a precipice that the estancia system cannot afford to have him reach. The Tehuelche workers maintain their own spiritual practices alongside and beneath the Catholic overlay. Practices centered on the relationship between the living and the dead, between human beings and the animal world, between the visible landscape and the forces that move through it. The older Tehuelche man, the one who found the tracks in the canyon, belongs to a tradition that has very specific explanations for the kind of marks he found. Explanations that his employers would find absurd. Explanations that, if you listened carefully, you might find not absurd at all, given what you have seen with your own eyes. The tracks. You are returning to them now, as you knew you would. The estancia's approach to discipline is not written down anywhere. It does not need to be. The system of control is maintained through a combination of economic dependency, geographic isolation, social pressure, and occasional, carefully calibrated displays of authority that remind everyone within observation range of the consequences of serious infractions. A peon who steals from the estancia, supplies, equipment, animals, is dismissed, which in winter means he is expelled into an environment that may kill him before he reaches safety. If the theft is serious enough, the capataz may report it to the police in Rio Gallegos, triggering a legal process that will not end well for the accused. Argentine rural justice in this period operates on an assumption of guilt for men of low social standing and the punishments available: imprisonment, forced labor in government work gangs, physical punishment in some jurisdictions, are not proportionate to the infractions that trigger them. A man who steals a bag of dried goods to prevent his family from starving is not treated differently by this system than a man who steals for profit. The law does not make that distinction. The law was not written by people who needed to steal to survive. Public punishment on the estancia rarely takes the form of physical violence, not because violence is considered wrong, but because visible violence creates a record, a memory, a potential grievance that can fester. The preferred mechanism is humiliation. A man who has committed an infraction is addressed in front of his colleagues by the capataz in a tone and language that strips him of any dignity the group might collectively assign him. He is reminded of his position. He is reminded of what he depends on and who provides it. The other workers watch this and hear in it a description of their own position, a demonstration of the distance between what they are and what could be done to them. There is also the practice of the cuenta corriente, the running account. Workers' wages are paid against a tab at the estancia's own store, which supplies the goods they need at prices set by the estancia. A man who is in debt to the estancia store, and it is surprisingly easy to enter debt given the pricing structure and the credit that is extended to bind workers to the property, cannot leave without settling that debt. He cannot settle it because his wages are insufficient to retire it while he continues to need to eat. This is not an accident. It is a mechanism. It keeps men in place who might otherwise leave, and it does so without the need for locked doors or physical restraint. The most effective prisons are the ones their inhabitants construct themselves, from the materials provided to them by their captors. By July of 1892, the political situation of Patagonia is experiencing a particular kind of tension that has not yet erupted into the violence it will eventually produce. That violence will come in the early 1920s, in the events that history will call the Patagonia Rebelde, when Argentine cavalry units massacred striking workers across the territory. But the conditions that will produce that massacre are already present, already embedded in the structure of the estancia system, in the economic arrangements that benefit the landowners and immiserate the workers, in the cultural contempt with which the men who own the land regard the men who work it. There are also the threats that come from the land itself. Patagonia in the 1890s is experiencing significant immigration, not just Argentine workers moving south, but Chilean workers crossing the Andes, European immigrants arriving at Buenos Aires, and making their way to the south because the land in the north was already claimed. This movement of people creates friction. The established workers on an estancia regard new arrivals with suspicion. New arrivals, often more desperate, accept worse conditions, which drives down the implicit floor on what any worker can expect. The estancia owners understand this mechanism and use it, consciously or not, to maintain their leverage. The Chilean boundary dispute is also a live concern in 1892. The border between Argentina and Chile through Patagonia is not yet settled. The boundary treaty will not be signed until 1881's follow-up arbitration process concludes, and even in 1892 there are active military patrols along the western ranges. For the workers on the estancia, a border dispute between nations is an abstraction that becomes concrete only when a military unit passes through the property, and the capataz requires you to cooperate with whatever they ask without question. The soldiers are not interested in the welfare of the peons. They are interested in the land, the livestock, and their own mission. You become relevant to them only if you are in their way. What war means for a man in your position is not the clash of armies. It is the requisitioning of horses you depend on. It is the consumption of food stores by soldiers passing through. It is the disruption of supply chains that were already fragile. It is the possibility that the patron, calculating his risk in an unstable region, decides to reduce the workforce or sell the estancia, and you find yourself without even the precarious arrangement that has been keeping you alive. War at a distance kills men like you through logistics, through the particular violence of absence, the absence of food, of shelter, of whatever thin protection the estancia arrangement was providing. There are 4 women on the estancia who work as domestic laborers, in the main house, in the kitchen, in the laundry. Catalina is one of them. Their lives differ from yours not in its difficulty but in its specific character. The domestic work is less exposed to the elements but more exposed to the household itself, to the mayordomo's moods, to the expectations of any patron who visits, to the constant surveillance of interior space that makes the step, for all its harshness, a kind of freedom by comparison. Childbirth on the estancia occurs without medical assistance in almost all cases. The midwifery knowledge available is held primarily by older women, both Criollo and Tehuelche, and it is practical knowledge, hard-won, passed through apprenticeship rather than training. It is also knowledge operating without the benefit of germ theory's preventive practices, without sterile instruments, without clean water reliably available, without the ability to respond to hemorrhage or infection with anything beyond herbal treatment and prayer. Maternal mortality in rural Argentina in this period is significantly elevated compared to urban centers, and in a place as isolated as this estancia, the margin between a normal birth and a fatal one is narrower than anywhere in the province. A woman who survives childbirth on the estancia is typically expected to return to work within a few days. There is no formal period of recovery. There is no acknowledgement that her body has undergone a physiological event of significant magnitude. There is the work that needs to be done, and there is the body that needs to do it. And the distance between those two facts is navigated privately, quietly, without complaint. Because complaint has no mechanism for resolution, and resolution is what complaint is for. What these women have, and it is important not to omit this, not to describe lives of pure suffering with no human interior, is each other. The domestic space creates a kind of intimacy that the external labor of the step does not. There are conversations that happen in the kitchen, over the fire, in the early morning before the household wakes, that contain the full range of human experience: humor, sharpness, grief, observation, the specific pleasure of understanding something about the world that your employer does not understand about you. These conversations are not documented. They leave no archaeological trace. They are nonetheless a form of survival. And now, the canyon. Late in the afternoon, when the light has shifted to the flat, sideways gold that precedes Patagonian sunset and turns the steppe the color of old copper, you ride with the older Tehuelche man. His name, in the Spanish the estancia uses, is Domingo, though this is not his name, toward the eastern edge of the property, where the land drops into a narrow canyon carved by a river that is now mostly frozen. You go because the capataz, despite his laugh, is not comfortable leaving the thing unexamined, and he sends you because you are available, and because sending a Tehuelche man alone to a Tehuelche discovery seems to him somehow wrong. The tracks are there. They are in the dried mud at the bottom of the canyon, mud that froze and preserved them with the precision of a mold. You dismount and stand over them and feel the familiar human reflex toward comprehension, the reflex that requires things to fit inside the categories you have already constructed. These tracks do not fit. Each impression is roughly the length of your forearm. The depth indicates something of considerable weight. The pattern is bipedal, 2 feet, a walking stride that covers a distance per step that you spend a moment measuring against your own body and find disturbing. Domingo stands beside you and is quiet for a long time. Then he says, in the careful Spanish of a man translating from a language that has different shapes, the old people knew these tracks. He says the creature they belonged to was not a creature they feared. He says it was old. He says old is not the same as gone. You know by this point in your life a little of what the scientific men in Buenos Aires and in Europe are doing with bones. You have heard the stories, the way news travels slowly but eventually, the tale of the large bones being found in the north of the country, the American and European men who come with their notebooks and their theories. You know the word they use, megatherium, the giant ground sloth. You know that these creatures are supposed to be extinct, have been extinct for 10,000 years, that their bones are museum objects, that they belong to a category called the past. The tracks in the mud are not 10,000 years old. You stand in the canyon in the dying light of a July afternoon in 1892, with the wind moving above you and the cold settling into the stones, and you look at the evidence in front of you and you perform, as every human being performs in this situation. The calculation between what you see and what you are permitted to believe. The calculation does not resolve cleanly. It does not resolve at all. It simply stays open, like a question written in the earth, like a pressure behind your eyes that has no release valve. Domingo says something else. He says that the tracks come from the south and return to the south, and that no one goes south from here in July. No one with any sense. He says this without drama. He says this the way a man says a fact that is important, and has always been true, and will continue to be true regardless of whether anyone chooses to accept it. You stand there for another moment. The horse behind you shifts and blows. The light is going. You need to return before dark or the cold will make the decision for you. You ride back in silence, and the tracks stay in the canyon, and the canyon stays in the earth, and the earth holds its history in the way it has always held history, without explanation, without apology, with a patience that outlasts every system human beings have ever built to make sense of it. There is a temptation, in looking back at lives like yours from a distance of more than a century, to ask why people endured. To ask why a society constructed on such thorough inequality, such grinding physical demand, such systematic denial of human dignity, did not simply collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The answer is not inspiring. It is not a story about resilience in the heroic sense. It is a story about the specific efficiency of systems designed to prevent the very conditions that would be necessary for collapse. You could not organize because organization required communication, and communication required time and safety, neither of which you had. You could not leave because leaving required resources, and resources were denied you by design. You could not appeal to authority because authority and the system were the same entity. You could not even articulate the full scope of what was being done to you because articulation requires a language for it, and the language available to you had been constructed by the people doing it. What kept you going was not hope in any grand sense. It was the smaller unit of hope. Tomorrow might be slightly better than today. The next meal might be more filling. The wind might drop for a few hours. The child's cough might ease by morning. The pragmatic horizontal hope of people living inside circumstances too large to overturn and too immediate to ignore. And there was this, the tracks in the canyon. The thing that did not fit. The world, for all its cruelty, was still larger than the estancia. Still larger than the patron's authority. Still large enough to contain, in the frozen mud at the bottom of a river canyon in southern Patagonia, an impression of something that no one could fully explain. The world still had edges you had not reached. That is not a small thing. In a life defined by constraint, the existence of edges you cannot yet see is the closest thing to freedom that is available. This world did not care if you survived, but it was larger than the people who told you what it was. And sometimes, in the silence after a discovery that has no explanation, you could feel the full dimensions of that largeness pressing against the walls of everything you had been told to accept. You ride back to the estancia. You eat what there is to eat. You do not sleep easily. And in the morning you return to the work, because the work does not wait, and waiting is not something you were built to do. But the tracks are still there. If you made it to the end of this, you're not just watching history. You're surviving it. Tell me, how long do you think you would have lasted on the Patagonian steppe in 1892? Subscribe and come back, because next time we go somewhere darker, colder, and further from any comfort you have ever known. The world has always been harder than we remember, but it has also always been stranger.